Hello， 大家好，欢迎收看韦博多媒互动。少数族裔媒体服务中心举办线上座谈会，详情请看。
And I want to be clear about what was released last week first, which is the Census Bureau released results, tabulations from the 2020 census count in the United States by race and ethnicity, and giving us data at multiple levels of geography, at the national level, which I'm going to talk about, the state level, the county level, which I'll share some data about the county level, and also down to the block level, which of course is important for the tasks that many states are going to be engaging in as they do redistricting. Just to be clear, this data is the first of many releases, and so we'll see some big picture stories on race and ethnicity, but we won't see the detail, for example, of, in the case of Hispanic Americans, what places they trace their origins to. For example, how many are of Mexican American or Mexican origin, or how many are of Puerto Rican origin. Those stories, we have to wait for more data from the Census Bureau for that. But with that said, let me get started and let me make sure that everything here is working. So first, a little bit about who we are at the Pew Research Center. We're based in Washington, D.C. We are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. So we generally just talk about data, and about data that either we collect or data that comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. So you're going to hear me in some of the answers to some questions that I may receive, not necessarily talk about the implications for policy or for redistricting, but I will talk to you about the data that's been collected and some of the patterns that we're seeing. So let's get started. So what did we learn at the census release last week? Well, we learned something really important, which is that the nation continues to become more diverse. I am showing you here a presentation of the data in the way that we have traditionally looked at the question of race and ethnicity from Census Bureau data. These are mutually exclusive groups of Americans, in other words, white non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, Asian non-Hispanic, other groups that are non-Hispanic, and then Hispanic as a separate group. And you can see that doing the analysis this way, the nation has changed and steadily changed over the course of the last 5 decades. What's interesting here is that today, in 2020, I should say in 2020, the Census Bureau counted that white Americans, non-Hispanic white Americans, single race, made up 58% of the nation's population. That is the lowest share that we've seen for white non-Hispanics in the United States ever. And so it's important to keep in mind that when people are talking about this decline in the share white, this is the big number that people are discussing. There are some other interesting details here. The nation's Asian and the nation's Hispanic populations have together, since 2010, accounted for about 3/4 of the nation's population growth. Half alone came from Hispanics. And the nation's Hispanic population reached about 62 million people, and now Latinos make up 19% of the nation's population overall. There were some other big stories in the data too, including the number of Americans who say that they are of 2 or more races in background. And I will come back to that later because I think that it's important to understand the nuance and some of the reasons for this data that we see, these changes that we see, particularly when it comes to how people reported their identities. But this is the big story: rising diversity in the country, a declining share of the population that's white non-Hispanic, though again, I would note that by far, the nation's white non-Hispanic population, numbering about 200 million plus people, remains the nation's largest single racial or ethnic group overall. So, a few more findings. First, how many people were counted? The nation's population in 2020, according to the Census Bureau, was from the Census Bureau. First, how many people were counted? The Census Bureau reports 331.4 million people were counted on April 1st of 2020, which is the Census Bureau's count date or the report date for these numbers. That's up from about 300 million people 10 years ago. So that gives you some sense of where the nation's population is going. The second important finding is the size of the Hispanic population. As I'd mentioned to you before, Hispanics make up 19% of the nation's population and numbered 62.1 million people. The population grew by about 23% since 2010. Some other important findings. The nation's Black population also grew and numbers around 40 million people and reached about 12% of the nation's population. Importantly, the nation's Asian population also grew, reaching 20 million. And I'm going to come back to this because I think it's important. It's important to think about how we talk about these populations because we want to be fair in representing the way people, the public, sees itself. Nonetheless, about 20 million or more, and 6% of the national population overall. American Indian and Alaska Native non-Hispanic people reached 2.3 million, or slightly less than 1% of the national population. There were some other very, very important findings, and as I talked about before, the nation's white non-Hispanic population is one that is declined. In fact, you probably have seen a discussion about the 5 million fewer white Americans in the country. That is really 5 million fewer white non-Hispanic single race Americans. So it's important to keep that in mind. Again, I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit. Some other important facts. Did you know that in this 2020 data, compared with 2010, 32 states saw their populations rise, but within those states, the white non-Hispanic population fell. So this story of diversity at the national level, increasing diversity, is also a story of increasing diversity in the states. So many states saw their populations become more diverse, at least as measured by the 2020 decennial census. Some other important notes. Did you know, by the way, if you ever go out for me with to go get a cocktail, I will pepper you with facts like this. So this is how I entertain these days. Did you know that the white non-Hispanic population had its biggest increases in Washington, D.C.? So the District of Columbia, interestingly, has the largest population group here in D.C. I'm in D.C. Are Black non-Hispanic Americans. They make up about 40% of the district's population, but the white non-Hispanic population share is 39%, according to the census. Almost equal numbers. And if you have been to Washington recently, you've probably noticed that Washington is changing. The District of Columbia has been changing over the last 20 years. Two other states, Utah and Idaho, had also had fast or some of the greatest white non-Hispanic population increases among the states since 2010. Let me show you some graphics, and these are taken from the U.S. Census Bureau itself. And I think that they have a wonderful set of infographics that you can pull to use in presentations like this, by the way. And there's some very interesting findings here. So first, at the county level, who's the most prevalent racial or ethnic group using these mutually exclusive non-Hispanic categories and Hispanic categories across all the counties in the country? Well, as you can see, in most counties, the white alone non-Hispanic population is the largest population in a county. So looking at the nation, in most places, white non-Hispanics make up the single largest racial or ethnic group. It's important to note that that doesn't mean that they are more than half of the population. It just means they are the largest single group, sometimes maybe just a third of the population, sometimes 48% of the population. But it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about this, that these are all the counties where different groups are the largest single racial or ethnic group. I see a question in here about margin of error. This is the census. So because it's not a sample, there's no margin of error. This is the actual count. So the other interesting chart or map from the Census Bureau is the one that shows you the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group by county, according to the 2020 census. And here the pattern is very interesting. You could see that in many places, Hispanics are the second largest group, or Black Americans are the second largest group. Interestingly, in many parts of the country, people of two or more races are the second largest racial or ethnic group. And you can see that in Minnesota, in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Indiana, West Virginia. You see it kind of through the middle part of the country. Of course, some other parts of the country, like, for example, Asian Americans are either the largest or the second largest group in many places in Hawaii and in California. So it's important to note that there's a real diversity in the country's racial and ethnic makeup. Just about everywhere, every part of the country has experienced some change. And my apologies, I'm trying to slow down my cadence, so my apologies. The other big story out of the census is not just the racial and ethnic diversity of the country, but in addition to that, it's the places that saw growth and the places that saw a decline. This map, also from the US Census Bureau, shows you where the US or the county level population in the country fell and where it grew. The orange, reddish brown counties are places that saw population decline, outright population decline. Green counties saw population increases. And one of the stories of this census is that the nation has become more urban. Rural places lost people, urban places, urban counties and suburban counties gained people. And that's also mixed in with the story of diversity, because in many of these places, like in Texas, for example, cities like San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston have grown more diverse, and not just as in more Hispanics, but also more Black Americans, more Asian Americans, a more diverse population overall. Here's another little factoid in case you didn't know. So you see, I got more factoids for you. Is that the nation's Black population, do you know which state has the largest Black population in the country? You might think someplace in the Southeast, but actually it's Texas. And Texas also had the biggest increase in its Black population of any state. So Texas is a state with a very interesting story over the last 10 years, if not longer, that is beyond just white and Hispanic, but much broader and a reflection of the national story overall. The multiracial population also grew, and this is the other big finding, is that the Census Bureau found that 34 million Americans said that they are of more than one race. That is up from 9 million people in 2010. And look at how big that difference is. This is a huge change. Why this change? Partly, it's that the Census Bureau changed the form or the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is a little bit different. Second, the census was done online largely, and online there was more room. There was more, the Census Bureau captured more characters in open-end responses. Third, the nation has been going through, even before everything that happened in 2020 with the pandemic and George Floyd's killing, the nation was already going through a growing awareness of its identity. You could see that with ancestry tests that people do. Also, the conversation around race and ethnicity that happened during the Trump administration brought a lot of awareness and a seeking of identity on the part of many Americans. And all those may be reasons why we see this increase, in addition to people just saying that they are because they are. They're the children of, say, a parent who's Hispanic and, say, non-Hispanic or white and Black. So there's a lot of interesting gains. About half of multiracial Americans are Hispanic, just FYI. And most multiracial Americans are white with another race. So that's an interesting combination, which of course has implications for how we look at the population. This is my final point. A lot of the Census Bureau's results included findings of racial and ethnic groups that overlap, that are not mutually exclusive. And I've been presenting mutually exclusive data so far. But when you take a look at the white alone in combination population, that number is 235 million. The white non-Hispanic single race population was 190 something million. So the white alone or in combination population actually grew, even though the share fell, but the population of people who say they're white in some way or another did rise, just like it did for Hispanics, Blacks, Asians, Native Americans. All the different groups saw gains, including white Americans alone in combination. Some other findings, some other race Americans is an interesting number. Many people say that the race is something other than white, Black, or Asian. And the Black or alone in combination population is actually 47 million. 7 million people more than the Black single race non-Hispanic population. Again, taking into account the ways in which Americans see their identity results in a different set of tabulations of numbers for the population overall.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yuri Verdensky. I'm an attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan law and policy institute. And we work to craft and advance reforms that will make American democracy work for everyone, among other things. I'm here to talk about redistricting. And American democracy is built on the principle that all people receive equal representation in the US House of Representatives, in their state's legislature, and in local government, things like city council, county commission, and school boards. What this means in practice is that all districts have to have roughly the same number of people. And because the population changes, not just in total number, but also in the distribution of the population, as Mark just showed, district boundaries have to be periodically adjusted in order to comply with this equal representation principle. The census provides the population data and the geographic building blocks for this regular redistribution of political power, which is why redistricting happens every 10 years immediately following the release of census results. In other words, over the next couple of months, political boundaries at the national, state, and local levels will be redrawn. The redistricting process exists to account for the different ways that the population has changed. And this doesn't just mean that the districts should have the same number of people, but ideally, districts should also be adjusted to reflect the demographic changes that have occurred, so that the increasingly diverse nation and growing Black, Latino, Asian, and Native communities that have historically faced discrimination and are protected by the Voting Rights Act have an equal opportunity to elect their preferred candidates. Unfortunately, in most states, redistricting is a very political and partisan process. And when one political party is in control of this process, it can be used in a way to disadvantage political opposition. Gerrymandering is the common term for these redistricting abuses. It's what happens when politicians ignore the public interest and changes in the population to draw districts that are designed to manufacture political outcomes without any regard to how communities are treated. The goal of gerrymandering is to lock in an electoral advantage for a party or a set of political interests or current politicians so they cannot be voted out. The two most common types of gerrymanders are partisan gerrymanders. That's when a party in control seeks to minimize the power of the other party. And racial gerrymanders. That's when the political influence of voters of color is minimized. In many states, these two abuses go hand in hand. And to put things simply, the goal of gerrymandering is to take meaningful choice away from voters. And that really undermines our whole system of government that was supposed to be reflective of the population. Those governing us should look like us and should, broadly speaking, have the same political views as the population. Gerrymandering undermines that. The problem with gerrymandering is that you can't out-organize it. It's not a matter of turning out more voters. And even though the concept of gerrymandering is pretty simple in terms of what it seeks to do, the tools are sophisticated. The political operatives predict how each household tends to vote and how likely household members are to turn out. That information is then used to draw districts that produce the same election results year in, year out, no matter which party has the more compelling message, no matter whether it's a presidential year or a midterm year, what party holds the White House, or other factors that dictate various political shifts that occur regularly. There are three factors that raise the risk of gerrymandering and whether a particular state is at heightened risk. First is if one party controls the process and controls state government. The second is whether the state is closely divided politically or it is a state that is quickly evolving politically. And third is if the demographics of the state are changing. When all three of these factors are present, the risk of gerrymandering is incredibly high. This cycle, the states that the Brennan Center is watching very closely are Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. There are three solutions to gerrymandering. The best is to give control over redistricting to an independent redistricting commission where map drawers don't have the same political motivations as sitting politicians. Just getting into is that the second key to stopping gerrymandering is making sure that there are powerful safeguards and legal tools that advocates can use in court to police redistricting. Unfortunately, there are very few of them at our disposal, and the Voting Rights Act, which was just mentioned, which ensures that communities of color have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of choice, has been significantly weakened by the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court has also ruled that federal courts cannot hear lawsuits against partisan gerrymanders unless Congress passes federal legislation. And so those two bills that you just heard about would create the tools needed to safeguard the redistricting process and make sure that all communities receive fair and effective representation. Finally, the third tool needed is sunshine. Gerrymandering thrives in darkness when political operatives can do their work behind closed doors and not show what they are doing. The more that people are engaged on this issue, the more that it's covered, and the more that people understand what's happening, the harder it becomes for these political actors to commit the worst abuses. As Mark demonstrated and described, the census results demonstrate that this country has changed and is changing. It is increasingly diverse and multiracial and multi-ethnic. This sort of pluralistic society isn't a thing of the future, it is here now. And we need political systems that reflect that reality. But of course, given the divides, this diversity is seen as a threat by many right-wing activists and actors. And so the growth and emerging political influence of Black, Latino, Asian, and Native communities could be met with backlash. The newest threat to the growing political power of these communities is an attempt by right-wing forces to move away from the equal representation principle, which I started this briefing by describing, and no longer having states count all people when districts are drawn, but instead counting only those who are adult citizens. This would mean that children under 18 and non-citizens would no longer count for purposes of representation. This is a very dangerous new idea that is being pushed by forces that are increasingly detaching from democracy as the composition of this country evolves. Limiting representation in this way would harm communities of color, Asian and Latino communities in particular. The report that I and my colleagues wrote goes into these impacts and demonstrates that discrimination is at the core of this proposal to shift away from total population-based districts to having only adult citizens count. There are two pieces of good news. First is most states have laws that require that everyone be counted. There are some notable exceptions. In Georgia and in Texas, the state law is silent as to how state legislative districts are drawn. And in Missouri, there has been an effort to change the law that opens the door to this practice. The second bit of good news is that states don't have the necessary data to do this. The 2020 census does not include citizenship data. The Trump administration tried to put one on the census and tried to have that data produced when the court struck down the citizenship question, but the Biden administration removed it, and the Census Bureau will not be providing states with the count of non-citizens. That said, given how dangerous this idea is, and given that it is being openly discussed, it is important for the public to be aware of its existence and the profound impact that it would have.
Again, my name is Jesselyn McCurdy. I am the Interim Executive Vice President for Government Affairs at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of over 220 civil and human rights organizations. And I'm here today to give you an update on the status of voting rights in Congress. Nothing is more fundamental to American democracy than the freedom and right to vote. But right now, our democracy is in peril, and unless we take immediate and direct action, we will lose it. To fully protect against racial discrimination at the ballot box, and to ensure that every voice and vote count, Congress must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act. I just want to share with you updates on where we are with these two critical pieces of legislation. On Tuesday of this week, House of Representative members took a major step toward protecting our freedom to vote by introducing the updated John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This was a culmination of a tremendous effort by members of Congress and civil rights advocates to build the congressional record of ongoing racial discrimination in voting. In the past few months, both House and Senate committees have heard from dozens of witnesses, received hundreds of hours of testimony, and introduced thousands of pages into the record documenting anti-voter schemes to block Black and other voters of color from the ballot box. This record is critical to ensuring that the law withstands any constitutional scrutiny from the United States Supreme Court. On Monday, before the bill's introduction, a House Judiciary Subcommittee held an important hearing to gather critical evidence in support of the bill. The Leadership Conference submitted a series of reports for the record that were commissioned in 10 states with more to come. The reports prepared by our partner civil rights organizations and allies powerfully demonstrate that Congress has an urgent imperative to restore the Voting Rights Act. Individually and collectively, they revealed that racial discrimination in voting after the Shelby v. Holder decision, Supreme Court decision, is pervasive, persistent, and adaptive, sometimes taking new forms, but no less pernicious. Shelby County took away a core part of the Voting Rights Act that gave the Justice Department the power to review any proposed voting changes in states with histories of discriminating against voters of color and Native American voters to ensure that these changes were not racially discriminatory. The court held that the formula for imposing preclearance upon states and jurisdictions was decades old and outdated. But the justices also opened the possibility to Congress to update such a formula based on current conditions in voting. After tireless work from our partners on the ground, we have now supplied Congress with powerful and controversial evidence of these current conditions. We expect the House to bring the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act bill up for a vote on Tuesday of next week. We'll be closely tracking its movement and will continue to call on lawmakers to update the Voting Rights Act with a formula that's responsive to what's happening in America today. We also continue to push Congress to pass the For the People Act, which will create national standards that protect our freedom to vote. The House has already passed this critical legislation and is currently being updated in the Senate as a compromise bill. We expect action on that bill in the Senate in September. No matter our race, background, or zip code, we all value the freedom to vote and believe that all Americans should have a say in key decisions that impact our lives. Just as we showed up for one another during the pandemic and turned out in record numbers in the election last year, we must demand our leaders pass legislation that will build a better future for all of us, no exceptions. Thank you.